When people talk about ignition systems, what they are referring to is the means by which the propellant is ignited. Now, of all the innovations that have had a big impact on muzzleloading gun design over the last 150 years, improved ignition systems has probably been number one. Now, there are three types of ignition systems used by shooters today: flint, percussion cap, and 209 shot shell primer. Of course, the one you use depends somewhat on just how primitive you want to be during your primitive weapon season. O'Neill, since you're sort of ancient yourself, why don't you start off by telling about the oldest, oh, I didn't mean that, ignition systems, the flint.
Remember when we were talking about the different types of muzzle loaders? Well, as you recall, the flintlock was the only game in town back in the good old days. And of course, the ignition type that was used was the flint, meaning that the spark that started the entire process came from a little piece of flint striking the steel frizzen of the lock mechanism. And of course, that's why they call the guns flintlocks. Now, this is the most primitive or traditional ignition system in common use today. But back in about 1850, a new type of muzzleloader ignition system came along that changed everything. And Chad's going to tell you about that right now if he can remember.
Now, I'm surprised you remembered back to 1850, but probably the biggest advancement in military small arms prior to the modern era was the invention of the percussion cap. Guns that use percussion cap ignitions are called cap locks. A percussion cap is a little brass gizmo that has an explosive material inside that's called fulminate. This cap is placed onto a little funneling device called a nipple, and when struck by the hammer, the fulminate explodes and directs fire down the channel of the nipple and into the main charge of the barrel. Now, there are two types of percussion caps that are commonly used in rifles today. One is the number 11 cap, and it looks like this. The second is the musket cap, and it looks like this. Notice that the musket cap is quite a bit larger than the number 11. And not only is it larger, but it is also more powerful because it contains more fulminate than the number 11. Both of these types of percussion caps are commonly used with cap-lock guns, replicating the guns used between about 1850 to 1870. Now, isn't that about the time you were born?
Up until a few years ago, the flint and percussion cap ignition systems were the only ignition systems used by modern muzzleloader shooters and hunters. Then shortly after the inline muzzleloader became popular, an innovation came along that changed everything: the 209 primer ignition. Now, this ignition was very well suited to the inline rifle. The whole idea behind the inline was that it was easier to use and more reliable than the antique reproduction guns we used before. So why not create a more reliable ignition? The 209 shot shell primer is the same primer used in modern shotgun shells. By adapting the inline muzzleloader to use these modern primers rather than the old-fashioned percussion caps, the inline was more reliable than ever before. You see, unlike the number 11 and musket caps, these 209 primers are virtually impervious to moisture, and therefore the chances of a misfire were greatly reduced. Also, the amount of fire delivered to the charge is substantially increased, which is good, but only up to a point, right?
That's right, O'Neill. Recently, it has been discovered that the common 209 shot shell primer may actually be a little bit too powerful for use in muzzleloaders. In fact, a standard 209 primer releases so much energy that it can expel a bullet from the barrel by itself with no powder at all. Unfortunately, it can also displace the entire propellant and projectile charge prior to the complete ignition, and that can rob you of your accuracy.
Today there are some new 209 primers made to use exclusively in inline muzzleloaders. They actually have less explosive material than a standard 209, but still plenty to ignite a muzzleloader. Now, these primers are made by Winchester and are called 777. This is because they were first developed for use with 777 propellant. But we have found that they work the best of any primers, regardless of the propellant used.
Now, These are really new, but it's worth your time to ask your dealer to help you find them. In our test, we have found that we've achieved consistently tighter groups with these muzzleloader 209s versus the standard 209 shot shell primers.
In modern muzzle loaders, meaning the inlines, the 209 ignition has really taken over the market. So much so that almost every inline sold today comes already equipped to use the 209. However, in a few states, it's not yet legal to use the 209 primer, so be sure to check your regulations. Now, we've got just one more product category to cover before we head on out to the range, and that's accessories, and that's coming up next.